Trade wars are loud. Interference is quiet. And the quiet moves are usually the ones that matter the most. They don't arrive with sirens. They don't announce themselves. They slip in sideways, almost politely. There are moments in politics where nothing explodes. No shouting, no threats, no emergency meetings broadcast on every screen. Just a small shift. A subtle step over a line most people didn't even know was there. Those moments don't feel dramatic. They don't feel urgent. They don't feel historic while they're happening, but they tend to linger longer than any headline, longer than any press conference. That's what this was. For weeks, the tension followed a familiar script. Tariffs being floated, pressure being applied, messages sent through headlines instead of phone calls. None of that was new. None of that was surprising. It was the kind of tension people had already learned how to tune out, the kind that blends into the background noise of global politics. Then something changed. Reports emerged that officials connected to a foreign government were holding meetings with internal political movements inside a neighboring country. Not trade negotiators, not diplomats working through official channels, but groups that sit outside the mainstream political structure, groups that exist closer to the margins than the center, groups that rarely shape outcomes on their own. On paper, it sounds harmless. Just conversation, just civil society engagement, something easy to dismiss with a shrug, something that sounds academic when described in neutral language. In real life, it's different, because when an outside power starts engaging with internal political movements during a period of pressure, the issue is no longer economic. It becomes structural. It stops being about prices and policies. It starts being about leverage. The timing mattered, not because those groups suddenly became influential, but because attention changes scale. Once attention enters the room gets bigger. And once the room gets bigger, the rules change. According to reporting, those meetings took place while trade tensions were already high. That detail alone altered how the situation was read. Not as curiosity, not as background noise, but as a test of boundaries, a test of reaction, a test of how much pressure could be applied without triggering a response. And the real story wasn't the meetings themselves. It was how the response was handled. When the question was asked publicly, the setup felt predictable. A careful prompt, an opening for a diplomatic non-answer. Something safe enough to move the story along without resolving it. That didn't happen. Instead, the response reframed the entire situation. There was no validation of the groups involved, no emotional language, no escalation, no attempt to argue the point in public, no effort to win a news cycle. Just a clear statement that internal democratic processes belong to the country itself. And then something even more important happened. The issue was moved out of the public arena, not ignored, not dismissed, relocated, shifted away from microphones and cameras, away from commentary and speculation, into formal diplomatic channels. Not social media, not talk shows, not press conferences designed to satisfy outrage. Procedure. This is where many people misunderstand power. They assume strength looks loud. They assume authority requires volume. They assume silence equals weakness. In reality, authority often sounds boring, almost disappointing, because legitimacy is oxygen. Fringe movements don't grow because they are persuasive. They grow because they are amplified. They grow when attention makes them look larger than they are, when repetition turns visibility into perceived importance, and when amplification comes from outside power, it changes everything. In practice, giving attention to marginal groups often increases their leverage by granting them visibility they didn't earn organically. That doesn't mean the ideas suddenly become popular. It means they become useful. Useful to people looking for pressure points. Useful to people testing how far they can lean without pushback. Historically, separatist sentiment in regions like this has represented a minority position. Levels fluctuate, support rises and falls. Sometimes it spikes during moments of frustration. Sometimes it fades back into the background. It tends to be reactive rather than foundational, but it has never been the dominant view. Most people are not interested in redrawing borders. They are interested in being heard. in resources, in fairness. They want leverage inside the system, not an exit from it. That frustration is real, and it deserves to be addressed internally. But when it's pulled into an international power struggle, it stops being about solutions. It becomes a tool. That's the danger. Not collapse, not secession overnight, but distortion. A small group gets outside attention. Headlines follow. Commentary escalates. Pundits argue. Social media fills in the gaps. Speculation replaces proportion. Officials feel pressured to respond publicly, sometimes prematurely. Each response feeds the cycle. The group appears larger than it is, not because support has grown, but because the spotlight has. This is how noise becomes leverage. The response avoided that trap. By naming who actually belongs at the table, the situation was deflated without confrontation. National leadership, regional governments, local authorities, indigenous partners. That list matters because legitimacy isn't claimed, it's structured. No insults were thrown, no accusations made, just a boundary. Then came the containment. The matter was moved into official channels. Representatives were tasked. Ambassadors were engaged. Paper trails were created. This step is easy to overlook. It doesn't trend. It doesn't satisfy people who want visible conflict. It doesn't reward outrage. But it works because documentation changes behavior. Once an issue is formalized, it becomes harder to treat casually, harder to brush off, harder to repeat without consequence. And in cases like this, procedural containment can neutralize interference without turning it into a spectacle. That's not weakness, it's control. Contrast that with louder reactions. Some leaders use strong language, words meant to draw sharp moral lines. That response is understandable. Emotionally, it makes sense. But it carries risk because outrage feeds attention. And attention is exactly what fringe movements require to matter. Anytime outside power gives oxygen to a marginal issue, the issue stops being about its merits and starts being about its usefulness. The quieter approach denied that oxygen. Of course, there was a counterpoint. Officials on the other side said these were routine civil society meetings. No commitments, no endorsements. That explanation deserves consideration. Governments talk to many groups. Dialogue alone does not equal support. But context matters, timing matters, pressure matters. Routine interactions don't usually trigger coordinated responses across multiple levels of government. This did. That tells you how it was interpreted, not as casual, not as accidental, but as a boundary test. Pressure tactics rarely aim for collapse. They aim for fracture. They work best when a country argues with itself in public, when internal disagreements become louder than external resolve. When unity weakens, leverage grows. That's why unity functions as a defense mechanism, not a slogan, a structure. In this case, leaders across political lines showed up together. Differences didn't disappear. They stayed internal. They didn't become tools. And that matters more than any statement made on camera. This wasn't about one region. It was about whether internal divisions could be pulled into an external negotiation. The answer was no. Not through anger, not through panic, through process. There's a temptation to believe power needs to be visible to be real, but the strongest corrections are often invisible. They don't feel satisfying. They don't create heroes. They don't trend. They simply restore balance. No borders moved. No dramatic announcements followed. Life went on. That's the signal, like resetting a fence after someone leans on it too hard. No confrontation, just a quiet adjustment. The line was crossed. And then it was put back. Not loudly, not theatrically, just firmly. And sometimes that's exactly what works.